Many people wouldn't really see themselves as judgmental, but that doesn't mean that judging doesn't feature really highly in our lives in the way that we operate. For example, when we are trying to guess what somebody thinks about us, or we have this kind of mental spiraling of what something means, or if we have strong preferences, or when we get the ick. These are the things that are happening because we are judging or we're trying to judge. Even when we're feeling judged, we're making judgment of other people or even of ourselves. It's not until we really look closely that we see how much these hidden judgments feature in our everyday and actually how much they determine the quality of our lives. Actually, it's very normal to judge. The judging itself isn't necessarily bad. It's the fact that we get really rooted in our judgment. We attach to our initial reactions and we ultimately are forming conclusions based off of judgments. Then it's those conclusions that can be a big source of our suffering. Satisfaction isn't what happens to us, it's how we relate to what happens to us. Right? So if we are experiencing the world for our judgment all of the time, what does that mean for our happiness, for our peace? It's like shining a light on how much weight you actually give your first impression. We can explore how far we're taking truths from our judgments, the self-judgment that we make. And also, mindfulness is literally non-judgmental awareness. So this non-judging quality is actually very important. But we don't become less judgmental, or we don't stop judging because we want to stop judging, because we try to stop judging. Actually, non-judging is something else. This is something else we can really explore at the end. What happens when we start to just notice the judging that we're making? How does it change the way that you relate to your experiences? It is the attachment that causes the suffering, not the judging itself. It's actually very, very natural to judge. When we grow up, we learn to label, to categorize, and this is how we make sense of the world. We give form to things, to understand things, to assign certainty. And I think that's where it gets really interesting, because there's obviously this connection between your relationship with uncertainty and your tendency to judge or really attach to those judgments. Because if you're quite desperate to feel very certain about things, then we can be making those conclusions much quicker and based off of information that is perhaps not always a truth. In a way, anxiety is your mind trying to judge things, right? It's trying to make evaluations about the past, or it's trying to make predictions about the future. Do we try and assign certainty where actually we needed to just get used to the uncertainty of things? Because change and uncertainty actually a very natural part of life as well. I think often our conclusions are made up of assumptions and personal experience or outdated information. Actually, assumptions are the easiest way to hurt your own feelings, because you are relating to what you think is happening or what you think should be happening rather than reality. So, for example, making assumptions about someone's intent. I think that demonstrates the bigger issue is that we don't suffer because we judge. We suffer when we mistake our judgments for reality. When we don't have awareness of this habitual system of assessing and concluding all of the time, we stop noticing that actually what we're doing is interpreting. We forget that we're judging. We stop seeing conclusions as conclusions and we start seeing them as reality, and we get very rooted in our judgments. Do you think that modern culture reinforces our tendency to judge and get rooted in our judgments? When I reflect, at every different level of my life, I've been fed rights and wrongs that actually, when you look at it, really many of them are based off of ethics and moralness. A lot of it's based off of opinion and sort of arbitrary things. So, for example, it's really bad to have gaps on your CV. Or like, your body has to, look like this. And I think if you're fed those judgments over time, we get into this kind of right or wrong mentality, reinforced by these different systems in the modern day, whether it's traditional media, newspapers, whether it's social media. I often feel like the world is just made up of, in my experience, this like, no, your ideas are wrong, my ideas are right. There's kind of like no opportunity for things to coexist. It's quite easy to see why people would become judgmental. because it's like we have to like justify ourselves through our judgment, you know? If there's another idea or opportunity for somebody else to be right, what does that mean about me? Does that mean I'm wrong? I think it's difficult to face that shame. So sometimes it's easier to judge other people than face that. I also think like there's this encouragement of really strong preferences, or like to really identify with your preferences. You know, things like, oh, you know, it's so sophisticated to have a refined taste. It's good to have high standards. You know, standards obviously aren't bad. Judging is very natural in the way that, you know, it protects us. I think like there's a lot of like celebration of your preferences. Oh, I can only go for my type, that kind of stuff. I think there's a very thin line between self-awareness and judgment. Like knowing yourself, knowing what you want, you know, great. It's not something to be judged in itself, but sometimes I think like how much judgment are we actually making through that process? And of course, preferences are natural, but it's like this attachment to them that will leave us disappointed when our experiences don't match up to our preferences. If that's the lens that we see through, then we can end up being quite negative, right? Because things don't work outside of the framework. The more conclusions that we accumulate, the more conditions that we're putting on our satisfaction. Restricting our satisfaction, you know, whatever the mechanism is behind judgment, seems to kind of like close down capacity and really narrow experience. I don't think I have many conversations where people would say, oh, I know, and I never worry about being judged. Like lots of people say, I can't shake this feeling of feeling judged all of the time. And that really determines the decisions that I make, because I'm constantly thinking, oh, but what would they think about me? What's really interesting is that it's impossible for you to feel that without you judging others, without you making a judgment about what other people are thinking about you. Or if you look closely, what we're doing really is judging ourselves. We're measuring up to those old judgments that we've kind of absorbed. It's like inherited conclusions that we've sort of internalized. Am I doing good enough? Good enough, good enough, well enough. And also when we get stressed, I think a lot of our stress really comes down to the standards that we put on ourselves, which are ultimately judgments. Am I stressed because of all of this stuff? Or am I stressed because if I don't get it done, that will say something about me? So I think so much of the pressure that we put on ourselves is down to judgment. We're not responding to reality, we're responding to our stories about it. We're very critical of ourselves.
I've been very stressed about people's criticism. And
Yes.
I've already preempting their judgment.
Preempting their judgment. Yeah.
Of how they're going to criticize my work.
Yeah, and I think if you've faced a lot of criticism in the past, which wouldn't surprise me because I think a lot of the systems that we experience are very kind of shame-based. That's my judgment of it, my experience of it. I think then we can then worry about that, right? And then that becomes really ingrained in us. So if we can loosen our attachment to the judging, or we can at least see the judging, we can loosen the hold that it has over us. How do you think that changes your experience of how you judge yourself? You judge your experiences? I think that you're giving yourself the opportunity to be challenged on the judgments that you're making, particularly of yourself. And that can really open up to different things happening, right? Because you're giving it a chance. Imagine if we had grown up learning flexibility of thought to the same extent we were encouraged to judge everything. Would we no longer be that uncomfortable with new ideas? Would we take opportunities to go to places that actually our initial preconceptions were negative? The opportunity to be pleasantly surprised. Could we actually then find amazing support in unlikely friendships? Feel peace in those moments where it's kind of like on paper gone wrong. If we get too rooted in our judgments, it's a very closed approach to life. And it goes without saying, if we're open, we are taken to new places. But what I think is really amazing is that if we can embrace differences, different experiences, lifestyles, things like this, we have this route to accepting that we are made up of so many different parts. And sometimes those parts might seem a bit conflicting and we want to hide parts of ourselves. If we can embrace different experiences, we have more acceptance that actually things are different, they're flexible. And we can kind of create this grounding in ourselves that's rooted in that flexibility rather than this sense of self that comes from intense identification from our opinions, our preferences. Obviously, everything's a balance. It's good to know yourself, but that's a process. That's not an answer. The process needs to be able to change and grow. You're giving yourself the opportunity to things to happen that you just don't know what's going to happen.
Exactly.
And that in itself is like an incredible experience, right? Jon Kabat-Zinn says that learning happens when we stop judging. So when we stop judging and when we stop thinking that we know everything about something, we have this opportunity to learn. But can we just stop judging? Is that what we want to do? Can we just say, no, can't judge, shouldn't judge? Actually, if we do that, I think that we're still judging. Because if we're telling ourselves, no, we shouldn't be judging, that just judgment is bad, you're judging yourself for judging. So mindfulness is not the suppression of judgment. It's the practice of non-judgement. And there is a real difference there, because non-judgement is about creating space for these judgments to arise that are very natural, to pay attention to them, to allow them without endorsing them, without attaching to them, and then eventually to let them pass. Because once we give that space, the emotional charge around the first impression tends to dilute and the flexibility tends to come in. So non-judgment doesn't mean never judging, but it means to observe your judgment without getting so stuck in it. Meditation generally is very revealing, but it straight away gives you the opportunity to see your judgment, because you will wonder straight away, is this right? Is this what's meant to happen? Why is nothing happening? Am I not good enough for this? This isn't for me. I shouldn't be thinking right now. So most people, when they meet this, will be turned off by the experience. But the idea is that you sit with it, because then when you sit with it, expanding from that restricting view of judgments is then a byproduct of the practice, rather than us forcing ourselves not to judge. Annoying people are like the perfect meditations, because you're really practicing patience in a space that you really want to escape. We watch what rises in us, those feelings of first impressions, those feelings of annoyance, and we see that judgment and we can let it pass. You know, that person might be really annoying. How much that affects you is something about the judgment that you're making. Compassion is often the ability to see from more than one perspective, even if those perspectives on the surface seem like they can't coexist. How peaceful do you think that would make life when you can really respect your own perspective rather than suppressing it, but have full acceptance that somebody else's is different? It's very connecting, isn't it? We're not stopping judging. It will probably be that we will judge less as we practice non-judgment. However, the idea is that we're being with it, and it's impossible to be present without this non-judging quality. Because if you're not paying attention to your judgments, you're not fully present. Your first impression might not change. You might have a pretty good, steer on something. And that's not a bad thing at all. Judging isn't bad. Judging keeps us safe, However, it's realizing that you are seeing through that lens. When you realize that you don't have to know how much you like everything, or you don't have to decide quickly whether you dislike something, we create a much wider view. So it's not the issue of judging too soon, it's concluding from your first judgment. And if you can give yourself just that little bit of space, not to say that something is 100% true, I think it completely changes your experience and how you relate to life. That's it. Bosh.
Very cerebral one.
What does cerebral mean?
Like,
Oh, makes you think.